Hi, welcome. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. People are filing in right now. We sure appreciate this midday break you're taking to do a little professional development with us. My name is Andrea Gonzalez with Trellis Strategies. Today, we are going to talk with you about Basic Needs 101, some non-tuition barriers and opportunities. So there is no shortage of need for basic need supports throughout post-secondary education right now. And we have our in-house resident expert, Carrie Welton, here to take us through this presentation and share these resources. A couple of housekeeping items. You're welcome to share questions throughout the presentation in a Q&A at the bottom or in chat. We'll probably reserve to respond those at the end. We'll reserve them for the end to respond. The other thing is we will be posting this recording at, probably in the next week. We'll post it to our website, and everyone who registered will get an email with a link to the recording, and we'll share these slides with that email as well. So if you have colleagues you'd like to share this information with, we will be sending it to you once the video is edited. Okay, I am so delighted to hand it over to Carrie.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. I really appreciate that welcome. And thank you all for joining us today. This is a topic I'm very passionately excited to talk to you about. For those of you that do not know me, I'm Carrie Welton. I'm the Senior Policy Strategist here at Trellis Strategies. I joined Trellis in June, so still getting my feet underneath me, but have a long history in basic needs, have been in basic needs policy and technical assistance space for about 10 years, currently working with Kentucky on their basic needs work and have worked in Louisiana, Rhode Island, Colorado, a handful of other states. So really looking forward to sharing all of the cool and interesting things states are doing with you later. And just a quick overview of our session, we'll talk a little bit about Trellis and our modern learner framing, and then we'll dig more into what I call the real affordability crisis. And then we'll go over some of the data from our student financial wellness survey to set the context, and then explore the landscape of non-tuition supports or basic needs supports, and really dig into some of the strategies and opportunities. As Andrea said, happy to have you put questions in the chat that we will respond to towards the end, where we'll leave time for questions. I also love to make this conversational, so feel free to hold your questions for the end, and happy to make it more of a discussion if you would like to come off of mute and join the conversation. So for those of you that are not aware, Trellis Strategies is a trusted research and technical assistance firm. We have nearly 40 years of experience in higher education, and our mission is to advance education and workforce development through data-driven insights. We specialize in quantitative and qualitative research and alignment strategies that support institutions and states to develop comprehensive strategies that improve economic mobility and workforce outcomes. Trellis thinks about the modern learner through multiple different lenses and recognition that people interact with higher education very differently today. We will talk about our affordability and financing pillar today, which is where our basic needs work sits. And we focus on these pathways because we know people interact with higher education. Traditionally, it was high school to college, and then you graduated and had a rewarding career, then got married and had 2.5 kids and a golden retriever if you were incredibly lucky. We know that is not the reality for the vast majority of learners today, and that the pathway through a credential looks very different. It takes longer. There are often more stop-outs, more coming back, different credentials along the way. And so what we really think about is the modern learner as multiple personas, and that learners of all ages are changing. Our insights work really helped us to understand that modern learner isn't a single profile. It's a range of experiences and obligations that oftentimes mean a student is secondary to other identities in the ways that people show up. So our conversations really center around the need for systems to evolve to meet the needs of all learners. And we're going to dig into what we think about as the barriers beyond tuition, which I know many of you are familiar with. But when we really look at some of the data, and these are kind of the pillars that I think about them across, or at least I thought about them across in the development of this presentation, is really across what are the barriers to enrollment, what is hindering completion, and then what is affecting our some college no credential population. And we know that cost overall is cited as the biggest barrier, but cost includes not only the cost of a credential, but also other affordability challenges. And we're increasingly seeing that the barriers related to personal financial circumstances and then the sort of adjacent mental health and stress that those are causing are really prominent barriers. So when we think about enrollment barriers, we know that about 60 million people over age 25 had high school as their highest level of education in 2024. And an excellent survey from the Lumina Foundation found that 77% of unenrolled adults say that the need to work or work conflicts were the reason they weren't enrolled. But despite that, 51% said that they were likely to pursue a post-secondary credential in the next 5 years. And then for currently enrolled students, most of this data is from our Student Financial Wellness Survey, which we will explore a little bit more in a couple of slides. We see that almost 60% of students across 2- and 4-year institutions were experiencing at least one form of basic needs insecurity. 70% of those enrolled undergraduate students reported running out of money during the prior year. And we'll dig into that a little bit more as well. And almost 50% of enrolled undergraduate students said that they had difficulty concentrating due to their financial situation. So we know that these barriers directly lead to people stopping out, and that, among the some college no credential population, 36% of undergraduates are not finishing. And 43 million Americans now have attempted a degree or a credential, but have not finished. And I found the one typo in my presentation, so we'll fix that later. And then when we look at the reasons that people are stopping out, research from our Student Financial Wellness Survey found that 30% of people reported stopping out for personal financial reasons. So that's across 2- and 4-year students. And then the Community College Research Center did a study of community college students and found that 45% reported stopping out due to financial reasons. And what I think is really impressive is, despite these steep challenges, the vast majority of Americans are saying that a post-secondary credential is still valuable or extremely valuable. And those are the, numbers there across all of them. I'm not probably going to read through all of them. A lot of data on these slides, which we'll be happy to share with you afterwards if you're interested. And that most Americans prefer, and that's across the political spectrum, that the youth in their lives do pursue a 2- or 4-year degree after high school. So when we think about that value of perception and what is driving some of those challenges, we know that states and institutions have really tried to contain the cost of credential programs. And that includes, increasing grant aid, freezing tuition. And recent data from the College Board shows that average inflation adjusted tuition has actually declined over 10 years. So it's down 7% at public 4-year institutions, down 10% at public 2-year colleges, and up slightly 2% at private nonprofit 4-year institutions. So those barriers that are driving people away from or out of higher education are really those non-tuition costs. And so I looked at the Consumer Price Index, which is our, Bureau of Labor and Statistics data on price changes. And what we can see is that just since 2020, just over the period from 2020 to 2024, the cost of everything is up over 21%, and transportation 35%. And then we can see that across food and housing, those are both up about 23%. So when we think about tuition versus non-tuition barriers, I know the iceberg analogy is a bit dated, but I thought it was so perfect for this presentation. And really thinking about tuition and fees is what we know is visible. For many of you, what you feel like is within your wheelhouse and what you understand at your institutions or in your systems. And what we see is that, only about 40% of 4-year public colleges and university, the cost of attendance is represented by tuition and fees, and that's 20% for community college students. So that means inversely that 60% of non-tuition costs are housing, food, transportation, childcare, and other barriers for 4-year students, and 80% for community college students. And we know that if people can't pay rent, eat reliably, or secure childcare, that affects their ability to enroll or stay enrolled long enough to translate all those federal and state investments in higher education into degrees, credentials, and tax-paying workers who can support themselves and their families. So what do we know about the converging challenges and why these non-tuition barriers are such a huge issue and what we can do about them? We'll talk about that as well. But we see that in the data across all post-high school credentials, research from the Lumina Foundation shows that about 55% of adults, all adults, have a post-high school credential, and that's adults 25 and older. But that by 2031, 72% of all jobs will require a post-high school credential. And that represents about a 17 percentage point gap. And then we specifically look at that across bachelor's degrees. About 23% of adults have completed a bachelor's degree, while about 42% of jobs by 2031 will require a bachelor's degree. So there's about a 20 percentage point gap there that I know all of you in your respective roles are thinking really hard about how to try to close. So now we're going to dig into a bit of data from the Student Financial Wellness Survey. And that survey from 2024 represented about 53,000 responses, had a response rate of about 8% and a completion rate of 82%. And what we see again is some of that financial difficulty data while people reported in college having experienced financial difficulties or challenges. And you can see that from this slide, about almost 75% of students at four-year institutions reported having financial difficulties, and almost 70% of two-year students. And then there's that number that I mentioned before, that almost 50% of students across both 2- and 4-year institutions reported having difficulty concentrating on their schoolwork because of their financial situation. And so what we see is 56% of undergraduate students would have trouble getting $500 in cash or credit to meet an unforeseen expense. And we broke that down here across different demographics that we know experience greater challenges. And we can see that many groups that face greater barriers to higher education are experiencing even more difficulty accessing cash or credit. And then running out of money. So we see that nearly 3/4 of two-year students and 63% of four-year students reported running out of money at least once during the year. We can see those across never, 1 to 3 times across the prior year, 4 to 7 times across the prior year, or 8 or more times. And I really want to draw your attention to that 8 or more times on the far right there, because this survey is administered in the fall. So if people are reporting that they're running out of money 8 or more times during the year, what we're seeing is that this is a cyclical or a monthly ongoing issue that is a barrier for them. And overall basic needs and security, we can see that almost 60% of students in the Student Financial Wellness Survey had one or more form of basic needs and security. Almost 30% reported both food and housing insecurity, and almost 10% experienced all 3 forms at once. And we know that basic needs and security is associated with lower credit accumulation, lower term-to-term persistence, higher step out and dropout rates, and difficulty participating in things like work-based learning and high demand programs. And even though there are high rates of challenges with financial difficulties and high rates of basic needs and security, we see that many students are working and are experiencing these barriers and challenges despite that. So 68% of four-year students reporting working for pay, and 70% of them have one job, 25% have 2 jobs, and 5% have 3 or more jobs. And actually, this data is not included in this presentation, but we see that the number of people who have multiple jobs is actually at an all-time high, which is probably not surprising given, the gig economy and people working multiple jobs. But I do wonder if things were more affordable, if that would be a choice for many people. And across two-year students, we see that 66% reported working for pay. Among them, almost 80% had one job, slightly lower, 19% than four-year students had 2 jobs, and 3% had 3 or more jobs. So we know that student identity becomes a lower priority for people and takes a backseat to other priorities. We see that among our survey, we asked about caregiving. So that is not just people who identified as parents, but were also caring for adults or other people in their lives. 75% identify as a worker that goes to school as opposed to a student who works. And that number was 28% among people who were enrolled and employed that reported not being a caregiver. And 65% of caregivers that were enrolled part-time compared to 35% of non-caregivers. And what we see is that many respondents had turned to food assistance and medical assistance, as well as other public assistance programs, which in my neck of the woods in the area I work in is Opportunity. And what we see is that 15% of people were accessing food assistance and about 20% were accessing medical assistance, which for me is particularly troubling given the federal cuts that will be coming down to SNAP and Medicaid programs from HR 1. We'll talk a little bit more about those later because there are both, first and second and probably third degree effects that we're going to expect from that will happen in states and to students from those cuts. And then I think about this shift from public benefits as a sort of separate program that exists for low-income people who are not enrolled, as really shifting the way that those programs operate and the way the policies operate from prioritizing work first, because they currently do, to prioritizing workforce first. Because what we saw in the late 90s at the sort of turn of welfare reform was these programs were more focused on getting people engaged in work and putting more conditions around their participation. But ultimately, as we'll talk about a little bit more, post-secondary education was excluded to, in large parts. And that may have made sense in the 90s when we had a stronger manufacturing economy, stronger representation from unions with bargaining power on behalf of their employees. But that really is not the reality. And we know that demand for workers with more education is only predicted to grow. So how do we really right-size those policies and systems to reflect that reality and ensure that we're maximizing federal and state investments in higher education, in workforce development, and across our public benefit programs? And so, the context for me is that high living expenses and college affordability are really harming people's ability to access and complete a post-secondary credential, despite that evidence showing increased demand for employers for workers with more education. And we can see that the result is that many people from minoritized and poverty-impacted communities are facing high levels of basic needs insecurity, not just as they're enrolled in post-secondary programs, but broadly, which makes it harder to access and complete a credential and really hinders that economic mobility and exacerbates opportunity gaps. So these federal and state programs that can support people with low incomes actively restrict and discourage education in favor of low-wage work, which really creates a poverty trap for people where they cannot attain the credentials they need to move permanently out of poverty and cycle back in a cycle of low-wage work. So how can we really ensure that those basic needs programs support post-secondary education to maximize those federal and state investments and support your state's educational attainment goals and really improve overall well-being? So the way we think about broader supports and, an ecosystem of supports is all of the things on the left are the things we think about as traditional higher education supports across federal, state and local, private and institutional. And what we increasingly see needs to be included and what we see as successful strategies are all of the non-tuition supports that are essentially left on the table, either through lack of understanding, lack of access, direct policy barriers, bifurcated federal funding streams, siloed state agencies, and partnerships that do not think cooperatively about how to build this comprehensive supports for students. And so with the areas that I work on are all of these that are the programs that can support post-secondary education. And my perspective is, federal and state governments spend tens of billions of dollars on Pell Grants and state spend a ton of money on higher education funding. Yet these benefit rules often treat post-secondary education as the problem rather than a solution. And when our benefit systems make it harder to go to college, they undermine our own education and workforce investments. But when we align them, that same dollar works twice. It works as an immediate support, and then it boosts credentials that can improve earnings, tax revenues, and economic growth. So across these programs, we think about nutrition assistance, and these are not an exhaustive list. These are the primary sort of federal benefit programs that we think about. There are a variety of different ones that aren't included here, like WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. There are a variety of state support programs. These are the big ones to give you a sense of not only the challenges, but some of the opportunities. So across nutrition assistance, we traditionally think of SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. SNAP provides a modest assurance that people can meet their most basic need for food. It is intended to be a supplement. It does not provide the household's entire need for food, and the average SNAP benefit amount works out to about $6 a day per person. But what we see is that everybody who applies for SNAP has to meet citizenship, income, and household requirements. And then they also have to meet certain work requirements or activity requirements to receive benefits. But enrollment in a post-secondary program is only included in very narrow circumstances unless your state or your institution has done work to expand that definition of post-secondary programs. And for students who are enrolled at least half-time, they're subjected to additional requirements on top of all of the other work requirements and barriers. But as I said, states have significant flexibility to determine which programs qualify that meet the definition of an employment and training program, which is broadly how SNAP thinks about post-secondary credentials and employment and training programs. And we'll talk about a couple of those very specific state examples later. I've got cash assistance and childcare assistance kind of in the same band there because while SNAP is an entitlement program, or at least was until recently, the changes in HR 1 have sort of changed the nature of that as an entitlement program with some of the cost of benefits shifting to states. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But cash assistance from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which we traditionally think of as, welfare in our country, and the Child Care and Development Fund, which is our primary federal fund for childcare subsidies, are block grants, which means those are set buckets of money that are distributed to states based on certain formulas. States have to add dollars to those programs, and then states administer them. And when people want to engage in those programs or receive support from those programs, there are a variety of time limits and educational requirements that include, combining work with education, limits on what types of programs people can be engaged in. There's academic progress requirements, there's minimum credit requirements, and then there's all of the administrative barriers that are required as part of certifying participation in those requirements. But again, states have significant opportunity and flexibility to define those parameters and ease those barriers that can improve the connections between TANF and childcare and post-secondary education. And then healthcare, we traditionally think of as Medicaid, is the primary program that supports people with access to affordable healthcare. Prior to HR 1, there were not nationwide work requirements in the Medicaid program. A variety of states, Georgia, had them previously, and other states had attempted them before, which we won't get into here. But those will roll out nationwide starting in 2027, which means anybody who participates in the Medicaid program must work, volunteer, or engage in educational activities for at least 80 hours a month. We do believe that there are proposals on the table to include at least half-time enrollment in those educational requirements, but we won't actually know what those educational activities will be until HHS, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, issues their rule, which is expected in June of 2026, which will define some of those parameters. And as we can see, as I mentioned, from the SNAP and the TANF and childcare programs, there can be some pretty severe restrictions placed on the type of post-secondary activities or educational activities that can be included. What I would say is that would be great for you to put that on your radar and for you to think about how your institution, how your systems, and how your states are weighing in on that notice of proposed rulemaking, which everybody has the opportunity to do, to express the importance of the educational programs that should be included under that rulemaking. And then when we think about housing assistance, we think of the income-based housing choice voucher program and public housing. To receive housing assistance as a student, somebody has to meet one of several criteria, which is very sort of closely aligned with FAFSA's definition of independent student status. So it is like age requirement, being married, having a dependent, and other things like being a veteran. And there is some flexibility for local public housing authorities to administer those programs and partnerships in ways that improve access to housing assistance. And then when we think about the sort of like other penumbra of supportive services and programs that can support them, the SNAP Employment and Training Program is the workforce arm of the SNAP program that administers the work requirements piece. And then we have PERC and CTE programs and the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Program that can all in various ways support childcare, transportation, tuition, books, materials, uniforms, and other forms of financial assistance. But really the funding and program siloing that happens both at the federal and state level, and sort of resource guarding inside those agencies limit that collaboration. So I just want to take a second and say that I know we talk a lot about SNAP for students and childcare subsidies, and by no means does the $152 billion represented on this table, is this me suggesting that all of those resources can or should go to people who are participating in education programs. These programs cover a variety of things that, also include like child welfare services, dislocated worker services. But I do want to just say that when I am talking about how do we think about creating an ecosystem of support that goes beyond traditional higher education, it really thinks about the scope of opportunity to access and leverage these resources for non-tuition barriers. I just want to share that it's not about $150 SNAP benefit. It's not just about a childcare subsidy. It's really about looking across the scope of these programs to ensure that we are not leaving dollars on the table that can really move people to economic mobility through education, which we know it reliably does, and with some exceptions. And how well are those programs doing that? So I looked at participation in the TANF Cash Assistance Program, and among people who are participating in the TANF program, who reported that the activity that was allowing them to comply to receive TANF was either vocational education, job skill education, or education related to employment. Only 5% of people in the TANF program reported those educational components nationwide. And there's some variation based on states. I think one of the challenges there is that TANF doesn't really have a separate category for post-secondary education, so we can't really disaggregate it by that. But broadly, a minuscule number of people are receiving TANF and are able to participate in education to do that. And then when we think about SNAP food assistance, and this is very specifically focused on students who reported being enrolled at least half time, there was a study done by the Government Accountability Office in 2024, and they reported only about 33% of students reported participating in the SNAP program, as opposed to, SNAP is a program based on its structure that does actually a pretty good job, with some exceptions, of meeting the need of people who are eligible for the program. And SNAP's ability to reach people who are eligible is actually about 80% for people who are not enrolled at least half time in a post-secondary program, which for me really expresses the degree of opportunity in moving that 33% up closer to the overall SNAP number of close to 80%. And then we think about childcare subsidies, this one's slightly better. We see that about 11% of people nationwide reported participating in either education alone or education combined with work as the reason that they were receiving a childcare subsidy. And so when we think about opportunities to improve access to supports, and specifically thinking about, I think about my role, because my background and experience is in the human services programs and it is in public benefit programs, is how can I help do the translational work from public benefit programs and public support programs to higher education to help you understand not only how these programs actually operate and what the remit of, human services agencies are, but really how to think about leveraging your position in your institution and in your states to move and remove some of these policy barriers to really help support your students and support people in your communities access and complete those credentials. And we know across institutional opportunities that prioritizing culture and well-being is incredibly important. Institutions, and these are just a very small sampling of opportunities. There's an entire, probably massive, report and analyses we could do on this, which is not a bad idea, something I'm currently thinking about. But really thinking about removing some of the institutional policy barriers, such as like award displacement and the dependent care allowance barriers, which make it harder for parenting students to include their cost of childcare expenses and their total cost of attendance. And then institutions communicate with students in a variety of ways all the time. I think one good example is sharing opportunity about available supports. And in virtually every state, I think there may be one or two exemptions. your public benefits applications are on your state's website, and they are often integrated applications where people can apply for multiple benefits at once or see what they're eligible to apply for at once. And so, it's very easy to grab that hyperlink or grab that state website and share it out. There are, has been recommendations to do basic needs syllabi statements from faculty, really centralizing support services, not just basic needs support services, but thinking about the ways that modern learners interact with their institutions and the challenges that they face. Centralizing support services is good for all students. So I remember, when I transitioned from my community college to an under 4-year institution, the campus was massive, and it was a huge barrier to have to go from one side of campus to the financial aid office to another for academic advising, and really centralizing those support services, just a best practice across the board. And obviously, I would say survey students about their needs. I'm not obligated to say that. I just think the Student Financial Wellness Survey is a phenomenal tool. For those of you that are not familiar with it, that is provided to institutions free of charge. And institutions also get a report and a one-pager with like an infographic and support with data analyses to better understand their survey results. And then again, as I said, the thing that I am passionate about is really trying to help higher education be a bigger voice and a stronger advocate in the access to and the barriers that are affecting people's ability to access non-tuition supports. So how can you think about working within and across your state to remove some of those policy barriers in those public benefit programs and to strengthen the connections across workforce development, and really also be a voice communicating about, eligibility for public benefit programs and educational activities. And, one example I will give is California implemented a student eligibility handbook, and it's available on their website. And it's a really comprehensive deep dive into SNAP eligibility for students in California that includes like scenarios and income exclusions and exclusions. And, these programs are complicated, but we can all play a role in increasing the communications and improving the quality of communications about them. And then we also think about partnerships in your institutional capacity. So you can identify opportunities to partner with your local human services office. As I mentioned, human services agencies that administer public benefit programs, it is within their legal remit to assess eligibility and support people's ability to apply for public benefit programs. So one institution that we worked with in Northern Colorado actually had somebody from their human services agency that was coming on campus pre-pandemic, coming on campus once a week to help people apply for benefits, troubleshoot their applications, identify what the status of their application was, help with sort of like the verification requirements. That is, a really good best practice and opportunity for anybody that is interested. And then you can think about coordinating with, I call them third-party partners, because they're sort of like your human services state agency. There's a whole bunch of intermediaries in the workforce, employment and training, human services ecosystem. Like Goodwill is a really good example that often has SNAP employment and training partnerships or work on things like WIOA adult education and other things. And they're really good partners to think about getting directly to think about how they can refer some of the people that they are serving to some of your education training programs. You could also think about working with community-based organizations. We supported some work in Louisiana, and Delgado Community College had this really amazing partnership where they were working with a local faith-based mental health organization to bring counseling services on campus, and not only like emergency crisis mental health services, but also like ongoing therapy services. So really thinking about the landscape of what services are available in your area and how can you work together to streamline access to some of those services. So now we'll dig into a couple of specific state examples, and I want to make sure that we're leaving time available at the end, so I may skip over some of these, but I did include my contact information. I'm happy to dig into this more if people are interested in having more specific conversations, because states already have proof points that better aligned policies support education completion, and workforce participation. And so a couple of state examples across the SNAP and SNAP employment and training programs, specifically on policy, I think about Oregon, Massachusetts, and California as exemplars who leverage their regulatory flexibility to identify more post-secondary programs that can qualify people for SNAP. And then when we transition into like very specific programs, Washington State has their BFET program, which is the Basic Food Employment and Training Program. And that is a partnership with every single one of their community colleges where they not only work to identify people who could be SNAP eligible to get them additional supportive services. As I mentioned previously, SNAP employment and training can offer not only access to food assistance, but tuition, books, transportation, childcare, licensing fees, welding booths, a whole range of things that we know are barriers. And Oregon's Pathways to Opportunity program and Pennsylvania Keys are very similar to different scales. I'd say Washington BFET is the most comprehensive. And how that works is the state partners with the community college system. And the reason that's such an amazing partnership is because the institutions that are providing those SNAP employment and training services, the community college programs, were already providing those services prior to engaging in the SNAP employment and training program. They were finding ways to support people with barriers. They were finding ways to support modern learners. They were finding resources to support people with those non-tuition barriers. But having access to that SNAP employment and training program means 50% of the dollars that they were spending on those services, they can now get back from the federal government. So it's called the SNAP 50/50 program. And it's bringing millions of dollars in untapped federal resources to Washington State in ways that they were not previously. And then we think about interesting partnerships. So California leverages the SNAP program to do education and outreach. It's led out of one of their centers, the Center for Healthy Families in California, I believe, where the Center for Healthy Families is getting federal and state dollars to do SNAP outreach on campus to students to try to get them awareness, benefits eligibility screening, and applications to the SNAP program. And then another one that is my favorite that I have to say, and it's not just because I'm biased, but I often say that we don't need new money to solve these problems. We need to be smarter and more strategic with the resources we have. And I have had the pleasure of working with the Kentucky Student Success Collaborative since 2022, supported their initial Basic Needs Action Network, where we performed a set of stakeholder interviews across the state to really understand the lay of the land. That was across state agency, workforce development, institutional people, state advocates, and then we sort of came together around a very specific, two very specific goals. In Kentucky, it was one, improving access to public benefits for eligible enrolled post-secondary students. And the other one was improving access to post-secondary education for people who are on public benefit programs. And through the course of that action network, which evolved over months, and there's a report, I'm happy to share it if anyone is interested, the Department of Community-Based Services, which administers many of the state's public benefit programs and also holds their health agency, said, hey, actually, we already have benefits navigators and they're all over the community and they're everywhere. Why don't we just put one on every single one of your community college campuses? So now the Kentucky Community and Technical College system has public benefits navigators who are trained in the state's public benefit systems on every single one of their community college campuses, paid for with existing state dollars, and that has now expanded to the public 4 years as well. So these are the types of things we can accomplish when we think about breaking down some of these silos and really accessing more of the resources that are out there around our shared goals. A couple of examples across the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program is on the very specific policy levers. Nebraska has what I would consider one of the best policies where they have identified that post-secondary programs just satisfy the work requirement. You know, there's some nuance to that, but that is a best practice for policies. And then Massachusetts and California have also eased the restrictions on TANF for people who are enrolled in post-secondary programs. But then we think specifically about, you know, TANF is has a lot of flexibility, which, you know, can be a pro, can also be a con, depending on the state. But California and Massachusetts have actually specifically used state TANF dollars to fund need-based aid for eligible students. That's called the Cal Grant and Mass Grant, respectively. And then we think about some of those partnerships. We see that in California, they have CalWORKs liaison. So that means that CalWORKs is the state TANF agency. California likes to cal everything, for those of you that didn't know that. And they have liaisons in their county human services offices that are supposed to be directly available to institutions in those counties. And then Kentucky Ready to Work is a really phenomenal, again, okay, maybe I am biased towards Kentucky, has a really great program called Ready to Work at all of the community colleges, and a couple of the 4 years, I don't know exactly which ones, where TANF eligible participants who are enrolled in a post-secondary program have access to work study placement. They get their TANF cash assistance. They get money from their employment and the work study position. And they also get priority access to things like childcare subsidies as a virtue of being enrolled. Like, when I tell you I love this program, it's so amazing. And then one of the really cool things about that is the income that those students are receiving from their work study placement is exempted from counting against their TANF cash assistance. So they don't automatically get a job and then lose eligibility because of the cliff effect from having access to that work study placement. And then Maine Hope is also a really great program where they have wraparound supportive services on campuses to help people access additional supportive services and benefits and things like that. I'm just doing a quick time check. Okay, I'm going to zip through these next couple of slides, but really great examples in childcare as well. Georgia has identified students as a priority population for childcare subsidies. Kentucky, again, allows full-time students access to childcare subsidies and part-time students as long as they're pairing that with work. Institutions can leverage dollars like C Campus and think about how to leverage PERCAs and WIOA to fund supportive services. And then in terms of partnerships, there's a really great partnership that's being led by the Association for Community College Trustees in partnership with the National Head Start Association. It's called Kids on Campus, where they're working with institutions to bring Head Start providers onto campus so they can administer their Head Start and childcare programs as opposed to institutions taking on that role, which we know is incredibly challenging. And some institutions have also partnered with their local, like YMCA, who provides drop-in care, to make that drop-in care available to their students. We know drop-in care is actually really critical for parenting students. And I just want to highlight, as I mentioned before, some of the federal changes coming down mean that Medicaid spending is going to be cut by about $1 trillion over 10 years. And you can see that's going to affect states to varying degrees, which is, of course, going to have, first and second degree and potentially third degree effects. So we know that those changes are going to affect people and that are going to lose access to coverage or have more expensive coverage than previously. We also know that that is going to potentially hinder their ability further to access and complete post-secondary credentials. And that downward pressure that is going to be put on state budget has really serious implications for state higher education. We saw during the Great Recession that state higher education was, cut drastically. It's treated as discretionary, and states are forced to make really difficult trade-offs between, supporting a educated workforce and a workforce that is ready to engage in jobs of the future and providing access to basic services. And when we think about the implications of the SNAP changes, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities did a really great analysis, and my colleagues at TICAS and I did one as well that looked at, just based on SNAP changes, what implication might that have for state higher education spending? And I'll just highlight, let's just say Pennsylvania here. So if 15% of the shift of benefits was shifted to Pennsylvania, at present, SNAP benefits are 100% federally funded. And for those of you that don't know, the proposal on the table is for there to be a state cost share for those benefit amounts. So if Pennsylvania was expected to supply 15% of the cost of benefits, that represents about $636 million in 1 year, which is about $277 million, which represents their community college spending. So the state spends $277 million on community colleges, and they would be expected to contribute $636 million to SNAP benefits. We know that has very serious implications for state budgets. So when I think about this work and I think about getting you all engaged in this work, I really think about how do we identify that aligning public benefits with post-secondary education? It's not new spending. It's a way to protect and amplify existing federal and state investments. And we know states and the federal government already invest tens of billions of dollars in higher education. But when students drop out because of food, housing, childcare, or other crises, those investments don't convert into higher lifetime earnings, better family stability, better intergenerational economic mobility, access to better jobs with higher wages, lower unemployment, lower poverty rates, and also reduced dependence on future public benefits, which is a goal for everybody. And as I mentioned, we have done work in Kentucky for years. I have experience working in multiple states. I'm very, very passionate in helping people think about how to bring these strategies to their states. There are some ways that you can partner with us. We work on policy alignment, landscape analyses, helping design programs that are grounded in evidence about what supports students across basic needs screening, benefit navigation, how to bring together and think about cross-sector partnerships, and also thinking about what data is available and building capacity to assess and monitor data to evaluate basic needs efforts. So here are some QR codes to our basic need, our student financial wellness survey, and my contact information. If anybody is interested, I think it was in the beginning as well, but just wanted to give you a second if anybody wanted to scan the QR code. And then I am going to turn the camera off, stop screen sharing, and we will open it up for questions or for Andrea to lead a discussion about questions in the chat if she's still available. If not, I can grab them. Well, with that, just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to engage with you in the future, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you would like additional information or to partner with us. And thanks, Andrea.